April 6, 1945. The waters off Okinawa churned with fire and steel. The morning sun cut through a haze of smoke as waves of Japanese planes, loaded with bombs stripped of any plan of return, plunged toward the grey silhouettes of American carriers. From the decks of the USS Bunker Hill, sailors shielded their eyes as the sky seemed to darken with shadows. Engines screamed like banshees, metal wings glittering in the light, and then impact. Explosions tore across the carrier's surface, sending plumes of black smoke into the heavens. To the Japanese pilots above, it looked like certain annihilation. Yet as hours passed and the haze cleared, the unimaginable became undeniable. The American carriers still floated. Damaged, scarred, aflame, but alive. For the men of Japan's special attack units, this defied belief. Each kamikaze sortie was planned as a final act of devotion, a human missile guaranteed to sink steel leviathans. It was a doctrine born not only of desperation, but of conviction that one life sacrificed willingly could cripple the enemy's might. And yet here, in the largest battle of the Pacific War, the carriers refused to die. Japanese commanders would receive reports that seemed more like myths than fact. Entire squadrons obliterated, dozens of pilots gone, and still the American fleet pressed forward, launching more aircraft into the storm. Imagine the scene below deck. The sound of steel groaning under fire, men racing through smoke-choked corridors, fire hoses whipping like serpents, medics dragging the wounded as aviation fuel leaked through jagged seams in the hull, bomb elevators jammed, ammunition cooking off, and still the command to fight carried through the intercom. Keep launching. Keep fighting. These ships, vast floating fortresses, were designed with a brutal resilience, compartment after compartment sealing off flames, redundant systems carrying the load when others failed. To the Japanese eye, it seemed impossible. To American engineers, it was the very reason these ships had been built. But in that moment, on those burning decks, survival was not assured. The kamikazes came in waves. From dawn until dusk, the air was filled with the droning hum of Zero engines. Some pilots dove straight into the island's superstructure. Others smashed into the flight deck, their planes erupting in fireballs that rolled across parked aircraft. The sea boiled with debris, the smell of burning fuel and flesh carrying for miles. Crews worked in a frenzy of controlled chaos, some men fighting flames with bare hands when hoses failed, others jettisoning munitions overboard before the inferno could ignite them. Every second was borrowed time. For the Japanese commanders observing from the mainland, reports told of firestorms consuming American carriers. Initial messages celebrated victory. Enemy carrier hit, massive explosion, surely sunk. But by the following day, reconnaissance planes returned with images that told a different story. Blackened decks, yes. Billowing smoke, yes. But the outlines of those ships still cutting through the water, still launching aircraft, still fighting. It was a revelation that unsettled even the most hardened admirals. The sacrifice of their bravest men had not broken the American fleet, it had only bloodied it. The concept of the kamikaze was meant to reverse the tide of war. In theory, no ship could endure a plane deliberately crashing into it at full throttle, bomb attached. In practice, American carriers absorbed the blows with a tenacity no one in Tokyo had anticipated. Each strike was met with countermeasures, layered damage control, armored decks, crews trained relentlessly to contain disaster. The result was not invincibility, but something close to it in the eyes of the enemy. A Japanese pilot could give his life, his final dive tearing into steel, only to watch if he even lived a heartbeat longer as the ship kept moving. That vision, even for the briefest instant, was one of despair, and yet the kamikazes kept coming. In April alone, more than 1,000 planes were unleashed in suicide waves. The Americans called it the divine wind, a storm of bodies and machines hurled against them. The cost was staggering, ships aflame, thousands of sailors dead or wounded. But the cost to Japan was greater still. An entire generation of young men spent in the gamble that these floating fortresses could be beaten by sheer will. Instead, the carriers stood as symbols of endurance. Their survival was not just material, it was psychological. Every time one continued to operate after being struck, it whispered a single, damning truth. Japan's sacrifice could not halt America's advance. As dusk fell over Okinawa, the carriers still smoldered, their decks scarred, their crews exhausted. But their silhouettes remained on the horizon, defiant against the crimson sky. Japanese commanders, sifting through conflicting reports, could scarcely reconcile the reality. These ships were supposed to die. They did not. And that resilience, the mystery of how such punishment could be endured, marked the beginning of the end. The carriers had survived the storm. And for the men of Japan, who had wagered everything on the Kamikaze, the unthinkable had just begun to unfold. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most brutal phase. Japan's empire, once stretching from Manchuria to the jungles of Burma, was collapsing inch by inch. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima had been taken after a blood-soaked struggle, and now the full weight of the American war machine turned toward Okinawa, the final stepping stone before an invasion of the Japanese home islands. For Tokyo, the situation was desperate. Supplies were dwindling, cities lay in ruins from relentless firebombing, and the Imperial Navy, once proud and feared, had been reduced to shadows of its former power. The great battleships Yamato and Musashi were either sunk or destined for suicidal last voyages. Aircraft carriers, submarines, and cruisers had been lost in battle after battle. Yet despite these losses, the spirit of the Japanese military remained unbroken. From this desperation was born a doctrine unlike any the modern world had ever seen, the Kamikaze. The name itself meant divine wind, evoking the typhoon that, centuries earlier, had saved Japan from Mongol invasion. Now in 1944 and 1945, it became a weapon of last resort. Commanders promised that each pilot's sacrifice would be worth more than conventional sorties. No longer would planes return to base. No longer would victories be measured in bombs dropped and sorties flown. A single plane, flown with determination, could sink a carrier, cripple a cruiser, or ignite fear deep within the heart of the enemy. Or so the Japanese command believed. At first, the concept carried shocking effectiveness. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the first organized kamikaze strikes tore into American vessels with devastating results. Carriers like the USS St. Lo were sunk outright, their hulls ripped apart by suicide dives. The psychological effect on American sailors was profound. How could one defend against an enemy who embraced death so willingly, who turned his own life into the payload? Each incoming plane was not just a machine, it was a man committed to destruction, impossible to deter. But by 1945, the United States had adapted. Radar picket lines stretched far from the carrier groups, spotting incoming waves early. Combat air patrols filled the skies, meeting kamikazes before they reached the fleet. Anti-aircraft batteries bristled on every deck, spewing fire into the heavens in a wall of steel. Still, the attacks came. At Okinawa, the scale dwarfed everything before it. In the space of a few weeks, over 2,500 kamikaze sorties targeted the invasion fleet. Destroyers, carriers, hospital ships, no vessel was safe. American sailors nicknamed it Kamikaze Season. The endless drone of approaching aircraft became a soundtrack to the battle. Young men, barely out of training, hurled themselves into the abyss, guided by a belief that their sacrifice could turn back the tide. Many never reached their targets, cut down by interceptors or anti-aircraft fire. But enough broke through to make each day a nightmare for the fleet. And yet, despite the ferocity of these waves, the American carriers, symbols of naval supremacy, proved far harder to kill than Japanese planners had imagined. Their survival was not by chance. It was the culmination of doctrine, engineering, and sheer scale of industrial might. The carriers that prowled the seas in 1945 were not fragile giants. They were floating cities, designed to absorb punishment, to seal off compartments, to fight fires with almost mechanical precision. In Tokyo, reports of these survivals created confusion and disbelief. Japanese intelligence officers had promised admirals that suicide strikes could cripple American naval power. Carriers, they argued, were vulnerable, massive flat decks filled with aviation fuel and bombs. A single crash should ignite them like tinder. Early successes seemed to prove this true, but as the Okinawa campaign dragged on, the data told a different story. Dozens of kamikaze hits had failed to sink even one Essex-class carrier. Some were damaged, some left smoldering, but within hours many returned to launching sorties against Japan itself. This contradiction gnawed at Japanese command. They had staked their last hopes on the kamikaze. pouring what little aviation fuel remained into training squadrons of pilots with only the most basic flight hours. These young men were told that their deaths would be decisive, that their families would be honored for generations. They flew in with banners tied around their heads, spirits inflamed with nationalist rhetoric, their hearts filled with fatalistic pride. And yet, after the smoke cleared, the enemy endured. The Americans, for their part, were learning to read the psychology behind these attacks. Officers reminded their men, the kamikazes were not unstoppable, not divine. They were still just planes, still just men. What mattered was the discipline to fight through the horror, to keep ships afloat, to rebuild damaged decks and to keep pressure on Japan until victory was assured. For every kamikaze that struck, there were 10 that failed. For every American ship damaged, there were Japanese airfields burning, factories collapsing, and fuel reserves drying to nothing. The great truth emerging by mid-1945 was that the kamikaze campaign was not breaking the American fleet. It was bleeding Japan dry. Every pilot lost, every plane destroyed, every drop of precious fuel consumed in a one-way dive was an irreplaceable resource squandered. The Americans could replace their ships, their aircraft, even their crews. Japan could not, and so as Okinawa became the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, the contradiction sharpened into despair. Japanese commanders, watching from afar, could not reconcile what they were seeing. How could men give everything, crash themselves into steel, unleash firestorms upon the enemy's most prized ships and still fail to sink them? The answer lay not in courage or sacrifice, but in something colder, more calculating, the design of the carriers themselves, and the systems of survival built into every beam and bulkhead. The Americans had not only brought overwhelming numbers to the Pacific, they had brought engineering designed for resilience, and a doctrine of survival that no amount of desperate sacrifice could overcome. The mystery baffled Tokyo. Kamikazes had been envisioned as the ultimate weapon, a strike so absolute in its simplicity that no countermeasure could exist. Yet time and again American carriers endured. By mid-April 1945, as Okinawa raged on, Japanese commanders began asking the same question in hushed tones: why aren't they sinking? The answer, though invisible to the pilots diving through clouds of flak, was hidden deep within the steel anatomy of those colossal ships. American carriers carried with them an advantage that went beyond bravery or sheer numbers. It was something structural, systemic, and almost impossible for the Japanese to counter. The secret was not only in their armor, but in the philosophy of how they had been built and how their crews had been trained to respond to disaster. Every kamikaze who dove toward a carrier imagined a single strike would be enough. A plane loaded with fuel and explosives, slamming into a flight deck packed with munitions, should have produced catastrophic chain reactions. And on paper it made sense. But the Americans had learned hard lessons from early disasters. The sinking of the USS Lexington at Coral Sea, the burning wreckage of the USS Franklin at Leyte, these losses had shaped a doctrine of resilience. By the time of Okinawa, the Essex-class carriers embodied this hard-earned wisdom. Their decks were armored, layered with steel that could absorb enormous punishment. Beneath them, compartments were divided into watertight cells. If one section was torn open by fire, another could be sealed instantly, choking off the flames. Damage control was not an afterthought, it was a culture. Every sailor aboard a carrier had been drilled relentlessly to fight fire, contain explosions, and save their ship. In effect, each carrier was not just a vessel of war, it was a fortress designed to be wounded and yet survive. For Japanese commanders, this was incomprehensible. Their own carriers, like those lost at Midway, had been swift but fragile. Built for offensive power, they carried little redundancy. When a bomb pierced the deck or ignited fuel lines, the results were catastrophic. At Midway, 4 carriers had gone down within hours, consumed by secondary explosions. They assumed the Americans were just as vulnerable. They assumed wrong. Even more unsettling was the speed of recovery. When kamikazes struck, reports from Japanese pilots often claimed target aflame, sinking assured. Yet reconnaissance planes flying hours later found the same ship still moving, still launching aircraft into the skies. How could this be? The truth was that American damage control teams could patch a flight deck in mere hours, welding steel plates over cratered runways, clearing wreckage and restoring operations with ruthless efficiency. Where Japanese ships would have been paralyzed, American carriers returned to battle before the smoke even cleared. Another hidden advantage lay in numbers. The Essex class was not a single experiment, but a mass-produced design. By 1945, more than 20 of these floating fortresses prowled the Pacific, supported by a web of repair ships and supply chains stretching back to Pearl Harbor and San Francisco. For every carrier damaged, another stepped forward to take its place. For every deck scorched, a fleet of repair crews stood ready to rebuild it. To the Japanese, fighting on dwindling reserves, this resilience seemed almost supernatural. And then there was training. Kamikazes could destroy men and machines in a heartbeat, but they could not destroy discipline. American crews were conditioned to keep fighting, no matter the cost. Flames might engulf the deck, explosions might rip through compartments, but sailors knew their survival depended on holding the line. Time and again, eyewitness accounts describe men refusing to abandon their posts even as fire licked at their uniforms. It was this culture of survival, born of both training and necessity, that allowed carriers to endure the unendurable. The Japanese had placed their faith in sacrifice. The Americans had placed their faith in systems. And in the cold arithmetic of war, systems proved stronger. Yet for commanders in Tokyo, admitting this truth was almost impossible. Reports filtered back of carriers surviving multiple hits in a single day. The USS Bunker Hill, struck by 2 kamikazes in May 1945, was left a burning inferno. Over 300 sailors were killed in an instant. By all logic, the ship should have sunk. But it didn't. Hours later, crippled yet afloat, it limped away under its own power. For the Japanese, this was unthinkable. If such sacrifice could not even destroy a single ship, what hope remained for their strategy? The hidden advantage of the American fleet was more than steel and fire hoses. It was the culmination of industrial power, doctrine, and foresight. Where Japan gambled on human sacrifice, the United States invested in endurance. The result was not just physical survival, it was psychological supremacy. Each time a carrier survived a kamikaze attack, the myth of the divine wind weakened. Each time an American ship kept fighting, the illusion of Japanese inevitability cracked. To the men giving their lives in fiery dives, this truth was invisible. They saw only the blinding flash of their sacrifice. But to the commanders in Tokyo, the pattern became undeniable. The Americans had built ships designed to outlast even death itself, and as the Battle of Okinawa dragged on, this realization sank deeper with every failed sortie. The kamikaze was not breaking the enemy. It was breaking Japan. Deep inside the hull of an Essex-class carrier lay the real secret to its survival. Not just steel, but systems engineered with ruthless attention to detail. The heart of the ship was not the flight deck, as Japanese pilots believed, but the network of redundancies that allowed the vessel to take punishment and keep breathing. To understand why kamikazes could not destroy these giants, one must peel back their armored skin and examine the machinery within. The Essex class displaced more than 27,000 tons, stretching over 870 feet from bow to stern. They were not merely ships. They were floating metropolises, carrying more than 2,600 men, 90 aircraft, and enough fuel and ordnance to wage independent war for weeks. But their true strength was less visible. Compartmentalization defined their anatomy. Each deck was a labyrinth of watertight bulkheads and fire-resistant barriers. When an explosion tore through one section, steel doors slammed shut, sealing off disaster like a surgeon cutting off infection. Unlike Japanese carriers, which were designed for maximum aircraft capacity at the expense of safety, Essex-class carriers were built to survive disaster as much as deliver it. The armored flight deck was a marvel in itself. Japanese doctrine believed a suicide plane striking at 300 knots with a 500-pound bomb would ignite catastrophic secondary explosions. But the American decks, clad in hardened steel, absorbed much of the impact. Even when kamikazes cratered the surface, the damage was localized. Below, elevators and hangar decks were shielded with protective plating, preventing the chain reactions that had doomed Japanese ships at Midway. The result was resilience, decks that looked ruined but were in truth still operational. Technology gave these carriers another edge. Fire suppression was not primitive hoses and buckets. It was a network of CO2 flooding systems, foam dispensers, and high-capacity pumps designed to smother infernos before they could spread. Fuel tanks were double-layered, their volatile contents sealed deep within armored bladders. Ammunition magazines sat behind reinforced blast doors, cooled by intricate ventilation systems. Even when struck, these ships fought back against fire with mechanical ferocity, denying the kamikazes their full destructive potential. But machines alone did not keep the carriers alive. Doctrine mattered just as much. Damage control was not an afterthought. It was drilled into every sailor from boot camp. Men aboard an Essex-class ship were not just gunners or mechanics. They were also firefighters, medics, and emergency engineers. On the USS Franklin, when a kamikaze strike ignited nearly every plane on deck, sailors crawled through smoke and flame to jettison live bombs by hand, tossing them into the sea before they could detonate. On the USS Bunker Hill, men smothered fires with their own bodies when hoses failed, dragging comrades from molten decks while refusing to abandon ship. This training created a culture of survival unmatched by Japan's Navy. Industrial design played its part as well. By 1945, America's shipyards had refined the Essex blueprint to an assembly line science. Each carrier incorporated lessons learned from the one before. When the USS Franklin barely survived near disaster in March 1945, engineers studied the damage and reinforced vulnerabilities on ships still under construction. Every loss became a lesson, every mistake a correction. Japan, starved of resources and production capacity, could not match this iterative evolution. Their last carriers were launched half-finished, underarmed and structurally weak. The contrast was stark. One side building resilience, the other gambling on desperation. And there was more. The logistical ecosystem surrounding these carriers. Floating dry docks, repair ships, and supply convoys shadowed the fleet like guardian angels. Though a carrier crippled in the morning could be patched by nightfall, its scars welded over by mobile workshops before sailing back into the fight. This system of constant repair turned what should have been permanent kills into temporary setbacks. For Japanese intelligence, the effect was bewildering. Ships reported destroyed reappeared days later on the horizon, seemingly immortal. Even the carrier's communications infrastructure gave them an edge. Intercom networks, radios, and coordination systems allowed damage control teams to respond instantly. Orders to seal compartments, vent smoke, or flood ammunition stores could be relayed in seconds. Contrast this with Japanese ships, where compartmentalized crews often died cut off from command, unable to coordinate against spreading flames. The difference was not bravery, it was design. The statistics told the story. Of the 24 Essex-class carriers built during the war, not a single one was sunk by kamikazes. Many were hit. Some were gutted, their decks torn open, their hangars engulfed in fire. But everyone survived. Compare this to Japan's fate. By 1945, the Imperial Navy had lost every operational fleet carrier it had possessed at the start of the war. Their final gamble, the massive Shinano, converted from a battleship hull, was sunk by a submarine before she ever entered combat. For the Japanese command, the revelation was devastating. Kamikazes were supposed to bypass technology. They were supposed to be unstoppable. Yet time and again the Americans absorbed the blow, repaired the damage, and sailed onward. This was not luck, it was engineering. It was doctrine. It was the cold calculus of industrial war, proving stronger than sacrifice. The Essex class was more than a ship, it was a statement. It told the world that America could build vessels that refused to die, ships that could take the worst humanity could hurl at them, and still project power across oceans. Each kamikaze that failed only reinforced this truth. Each carrier that endured whispered the same message to Tokyo: your sacrifices cannot stop us. In the smoke and chaos of Okinawa, Japanese commanders began to understand. The secret advantage was not mystical. It was not divine. It was steel, fire suppression, compartmentalization, and an army of men trained to live in hell and still fight on. Against this, even the most devoted suicide strike could not prevail. April 16, 1945. Dawn broke over the waters east of Okinawa, but for the men aboard Task Force 58, there was no such thing as peace in daylight. Radar screens flickered with approaching blips. Lookouts peered through haze, their voices sharp as they shouted warnings. Kamikazes were coming again. The target this time, the carriers that kept the skies filled with American fighters. And among those ships was the USS Intrepid, already scarred from earlier battles, now about to endure another test of fire. At 11:00 a.m., the first wave arrived. Dozens of Japanese planes, some stripped bare to maximize speed, dove toward the gray silhouettes of American warships. The sky erupted in tracers, bursts of flak tearing holes in the morning light. Fighters scrambled to intercept, dogfights twisting above the fleet. Yet, as always, a few kamikazes broke through. 1-0, its nose burning, plunged straight into Intrepid's flight deck. The impact detonated across parked aircraft, flames racing in every direction. Men scrambled, hurling bombs and fuel tanks overboard, as the inferno clawed its way across the steel deck. For the Japanese pilot, it was mission accomplished. For the American crew, it was only the beginning. Damage control sprang into motion. Fire teams surged forward, foam spraying in wide arcs, hoses snaking across the blistering deck. Pilots trapped in cockpits were dragged to safety, their faces charred and uniforms aflame. Bulkheads shuddered as compartments were sealed, isolating the fire. Within 30 minutes, the inferno that should have consumed the ship was beaten back into silence. Smoke still poured into the heavens, but below the engines churned steady, the command tower intact. And then, almost impossibly, the Intrepid launched planes again that same afternoon. To Japanese eyes, this should not have been possible. Yet there she was, wounded, blackened, but alive. The story was the same for carrier after carrier. The USS Bunker Hill faced perhaps the deadliest kamikaze attack of all on May 11, 1945. 2 planes, diving in quick succession, smashed into her flight deck within 30 seconds of each other. The result was apocalyptic. Aviation fuel ignited in torrents. Aircraft exploded like firebombs. Men were hurled into the sea as the ship shook beneath their feet. More than 390 sailors were killed, and another 260 wounded. The scene resembled the very image of destruction Japanese commanders had envisioned when they first conceived the kamikaze. Yet when the smoke finally began to thin, the ship had not sunk. Her hull still floated, her engines still turned, and within hours she began limping toward safety. For Japan, this was unthinkable. The USS Franklin offered another example. On March 19, 1945, a single Japanese plane slipped through the defenses and dropped 2 bombs onto the carrier's deck. The explosions touched off a chain reaction. Planes loaded with fuel and ammunition ignited in an instant, creating a rolling wall of fire. Nearly 800 men were killed in minutes, and for a time the Franklin seemed doomed. Yet the crew refused to abandon her. Survivors fought the flames for hours, choking on smoke, crawling through corridors filled with heat and shrapnel. Against every expectation, the ship survived. Barely able to steam, the Franklin staggered back to Pearl Harbor, a burned, battered survivor that should have been a grave. Reports of these incidents rippled back to Tokyo with devastating effect. Japanese commanders had promised their emperor that kamikaze would cripple the American fleet. Instead, they read account after account of carriers surviving multiple strikes. A carrier might lose hundreds of men, her decks scarred and blackened, but she would not sink. Worse still, many resumed operations within days. The very ships Japan had sacrificed entire squadrons to destroy continued to dominate the skies over Okinawa. For the sailors of Japan's special attack units, this truth was hidden. They dove believing their sacrifice would be decisive, that their families would honor their names because their deaths had struck a killing blow. But for those in command, the picture was darker. They knew the cost was mounting with little to show in return. More than 1,500 kamikaze sorties were launched during the Okinawa campaign. Dozens of American ships were damaged, but not a single Essex-class carrier was sunk. The math was undeniable. Sacrifice on a massive scale was yielding nothing but exhaustion and despair. Still, the Japanese persisted. Day after day, waves of kamikazes hurled themselves at the American fleet. Destroyers were shattered, smaller carriers burned, but the great Essex-class flagships endured, their presence unshaken. The psychological toll shifted from the Americans to the Japanese. Each failed attempt chipped away at the belief that sacrifice alone could alter the outcome. Each surviving carrier stood as a monument to futility, and so the decisive battles of Okinawa became not only contests of steel and fire, but of endurance and will. For the Americans, each survival was proof of their system's strength. For Japan, each failure was another step toward the abyss. In the end, the Kamikaze had done its worst, and still the carriers lived. Their survival was not mere fortune, but the product of foresight, engineering, and a relentless doctrine of damage control. To Japanese commanders, it was a revelation too bitter to speak aloud. Their last great weapon had failed against an enemy that simply refused to die. By late May 1945, Okinawa had become less a battle and more a siege. The island itself was being ground down inch by inch, while offshore the seas boiled with constant struggle. American radar picket destroyers, small lightly armored ships stationed miles ahead of the fleet, absorbed the brunt of the Kamikaze storm. Their lonely watches turned them into the first and often last line of defense. It was here, in these exposed positions, that the true cost of Japan's desperation revealed itself. Destroyers like the USS Laffey earned grim reputations as unsinkable, though only barely. On April 16th, she was attacked by no fewer than 22 Japanese planes. Kamikazes plunged into her decks. Bombs tore through her hull. Fires roared in every compartment. For 80 minutes, the crew fought for survival, manning anti-aircraft guns as flames scorched their skin. By all logic, the ship should have broken apart and sunk beneath the waves. Yet the Laffey remained afloat, battered but defiant. Sailors who staggered off her decks could scarcely believe they had lived through what one survivor called a vision of hell itself. Other ships were not so fortunate. The USS Drexler, another radar picket destroyer, met her end on May 28th when kamikazes struck in rapid succession. Within moments, she capsized and sank, taking more than 150 men with her. The water boiled with oil fires and debris as nearby ships pulled survivors from the waves. It was a harsh reminder that while many American ships could endure the kamikaze's wrath, not all would be spared. Still, the scale of destruction on the Japanese side dwarfed all American losses. Each kamikaze meant the death of not only a pilot, but also the aircraft, the fuel, and the training poured into him. Japan was burning through its last reserves of men and machines. Entire squadrons vanished into fire without leaving more than a scratch on their targets. By June, the special attack units had claimed the lives of nearly 4,000 pilots, many of them little more than teenagers. Their sacrifice had inflicted pain, yes, but not victory. American sailors grew hardened to the constant danger. They learned to spot the sun glinting off a diving Zero, to track the shriek of its engine in their sleep. They buried their dead quickly and returned to their stations without pause. In the strange calculus of war, survival became its own form of triumph. Each day the carriers still floated, each sortie they launched, was proof that the Japanese strategy was failing. For Japanese commanders, the reality could no longer be denied. The Essex-class carriers had survived repeated direct hits. The American industrial machine ensured that even damaged ships could be repaired and returned to battle in weeks. Japan, by contrast, had no replacements for its dwindling squadrons. The dream that kamikaze might tilt the balance at Okinawa was crumbling, even as more young men were sent on one-way missions. In Tokyo, whispers spread through the ranks of officers who dared to speak candidly. "We are sacrificing our young men for nothing," one lamented in a private diary. "Each life we give is swallowed by the sea, leaving no mark upon the enemy." Yet still the orders came, and still the young men climbed into cockpits, bound by duty and the illusion of honor. The Americans, meanwhile, grew to respect the determination of their foe, even as they cursed the method. Pilots wrote home describing the eerie sight of enemy planes refusing to pull away, the moment of recognition as death became inevitable. Some admitted to nightmares of faces they would never know, men they killed before they could kill them. The kamikaze left scars not only in steel but in memory. By the end of May, the pattern was unmistakable. The Japanese could strike. They could wound. They could kill. But they could not break the backbone of the fleet. Each attack that failed to sink a carrier widened the gap between reality and expectation. Japan's strategy had devolved into sacrifice for sacrifice's sake. The sea around Okinawa became a graveyard of steel and bone. For every American destroyer lost, dozens of Japanese planes had plunged into oblivion. For every hole torn in a carrier's deck, 10 more were patched and painted over by men who refused to let their ship die. Slowly, relentlessly, the balance tipped. The Americans endured. The Japanese bled. What began as Japan's last hope was becoming their final despair. By June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had reached its brutal climax. The island was nearly consumed, its ridges and caves reduced to rubble, its defenders fighting to the last man. Offshore, the Kamikaze campaign still raged, but the truth was undeniable. Japan's grand gamble had failed. The divine wind, once imagined as a force to sweep away invaders, had become instead a tide of sacrifice with no return. The Essex-class carriers, the very heart of American naval power, still lived. They bore scars, twisted steel, scorched flight decks, crews who carried the weight of endless days of fire and smoke. But they floated. They launched planes. They commanded the skies. For every kamikaze that struck them, another squadron of American fighters soared into battle hours later. The resilience of these ships revealed the futility of Japan's desperate strategy. Japanese records tell of commanders pleading for more volunteers, even as the results grew worse. Pilots who once believed their sacrifice would sink a mighty carrier began to whisper doubts. Some were so young, they had never flown combat before their final mission. Diaries recovered after the war spoke of fear, loneliness, and the aching wish to see home again. They did not die as symbols of unstoppable power. They died as boys hurled against an enemy their leaders could not defeat. The Americans, hardened by fire, carried their own scars. Sailors recalled the shriek of diving engines, the sudden blossom of fire as steel met flesh. Survivors of the USS Bunker Hill and Franklin would never forget the sight of comrades consumed in seconds, or the silence that followed once the flames were out. The kamikaze left an imprint, not only in the annals of strategy, but in the human memory of every man who endured them. By the campaign's end, Japan had launched more than 1,100 kamikaze sorties at Okinawa. They sank around 30 American ships, damaged hundreds more, and killed thousands of sailors. Yet not a single Essex-class carrier was lost. The core of the fleet remained intact, and with it American air power reigned supreme. The kamikaze had burned brightly, but like a candle against a storm, their flame could not last. In the broader story of the Pacific War, Okinawa marked the twilight of Japan's ability to resist. The loss of life, both military and civilian, was staggering. For Japan, the failure of the kamikaze confirmed what many already feared. The war could not be won. The final weapon of desperation had been exhausted, leaving only surrender or annihilation. In the years since, the image of the kamikaze has lingered, sometimes romanticized, sometimes condemned, always haunting. To the men who faced them, there was no poetry in their deaths, only terror and destruction. To the young pilots themselves, there was no glory, only the certainty of an ending they did not choose. And to history, their story remains a warning that when leaders sacrifice the young on the altar of hopelessness, the cost is measured not in victories but in wasted lives. The Essex-class carriers stand as silent monuments to that truth. Wounded, battered, yet unbroken, they carried the war to Japan's doorstep. They showed that technology, training, and discipline could withstand even the most fanatical assault. And they proved that in war, desperation is no substitute for strength. As the guns fell silent over Okinawa and the sea claimed the bodies of thousands, one lesson was etched in steel and memory alike. The kamikaze had not destroyed the American carriers. Instead, their sacrifice revealed the emptiness of Japan's last hope. The carriers lived. Japan's dream of turning the tide had died, and with that, the Pacific War entered its final inevitable chapter.